The man was not breathing. He lay on the sidewalk outside the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Chicago, his body at an angle that suggested he had gone down hard and fast. People formed a loose circle around him, close enough to look, but far enough to avoid responsibility. Someone was screaming for an ambulance. Someone else was on their phone filming. A woman in a business suit kept saying, "Oh my God," over and over like a broken recording. The man's lips were blue. His eyes were half open but unseeing. His chest was still. A hotel doorman was attempting CPR, his hands shaking as he pumped the man's chest with uneven rhythm. "Come on," he kept saying. "Come on, stay with me." But his compressions were too shallow, his pace too fast, his positioning wrong. The man was dying, and everyone watching knew it, even if they did not know why. Then someone pushed through the crowd. Not rushed. Not frantic. Just steady and direct, moving through the circle of onlookers like water through cracks. He was wearing a stained brown jacket too large for his frame, cargo pants held up with rope instead of a belt, boots that had long ago surrendered to weather and wear. His hair was gray and too long, his face weathered, his hands rough. People stepped back when they saw him approaching. Not because they recognized him, but because they recognized what he was. Homeless. The kind of person you avoid eye contact with, the kind whose presence makes you uncomfortable. He dropped to his knees beside the dying man without hesitation. "Stop," he said to the doorman. His voice was quiet, but carried absolute authority. "You are breaking his ribs, and you are not getting air into his lungs. Move." The doorman looked up, confused, offended. "I know CPR. I am certified. You're doing it wrong. Move." Something in the homeless man's tone made the doorman shift aside. The homeless man placed his hands on the dying man's chest, his fingers finding position with the precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times. His first compression was deep, controlled, followed by another at exactly the right interval. "Someone call it out," the homeless man said. "Count to 30. Nobody moved. "Now," he said, harder this time. A young man in the crowd started counting. 1, 2, 3. The homeless man worked in perfect rhythm, his compressions steady and deep, his focus absolute. At 30, he tilted the dying man's head back, checked his airway with a quick finger sweep, and gave 2 rescue breaths that visibly lifted the man's chest. Then back to compressions. 30 more. 2 breaths. 30 more. The crowd had gone silent now, watching this impossible scene. A homeless man performing CPR with the competence of a trained professional. His hands never wavered. His count never faltered. There was no panic in his movements, no uncertainty. Just practiced, mechanical precision. "Where is the ambulance?" someone asked. 6 minutes out, someone else replied. The homeless man did not acknowledge them. He just kept working, his entire world reduced to the man beneath his hands, to the compressions and breaths, to the rhythm that might pull someone back from the edge of death. 2 minutes passed. 3. The homeless man's breathing was labored now, sweat running down his face, despite the cold November air, but his compressions did not slow or weaken. Then the dying man gasped. It was a terrible sound, wet and ragged, but it was breath. His chest rose on its own. His eyes fluttered. Color began to return to his lips. The homeless man immediately rolled him into the recovery position, monitoring his breathing, his fingers on the man's neck checking his pulse. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "You're okay. Just breathe. You're okay." Sirens were close now, the wail of an ambulance cutting through city noise. The crowd parted as paramedics rushed through with a gurney and equipment. "What happened?" the first paramedic asked, dropping beside the now breathing man. "Cardiac arrest," the homeless man said, standing up and backing away. "He was down for approximately 3 minutes before I started CPR. I maintained compressions for 4.5 minutes. He regained pulse and spontaneous respiration about 30 seconds ago. Pulse is weak but steady, approximately 60 beats per minute. Breathing is shallow but adequate. He needs transport immediately." The paramedic looked at the homeless man with sharp attention. Those were not the words of a random bystander. Those were clinical terms, precise observations, the language of someone with medical training. "Are you a doctor?" the paramedic asked. The homeless man did not answer. He was already moving away from the scene, slipping back into the crowd that was now pressed tight against storefronts as the paramedics worked. "Wait," the paramedic called. "Sir, we need your statement. We need to know what happened before we arrived." But the homeless man kept walking, his shoulders hunched, his face turned away. Within seconds, he had disappeared into the flow of pedestrians on Michigan Avenue, anonymous and invisible once again. The paramedics loaded the man onto the gurney. As they lifted him, something fell from his wrist and clattered on the pavement. One of the bystanders picked it up. It was a watch. Not just any watch. A Patek Philippe Grand Complications, the kind of timepiece that cost more than most people's houses. The kind that appeared in magazines, on the wrists of CEOs and politicians and people whose names everyone knew. "Jesus," the bystander whispered. "Do you know who this is?" Someone else in the crowd had already pulled out their phone, was already searching, was already making the connection between the expensive watch and the unconscious man's face. "That is Richard Ashford," someone said. "That is Richard Ashford." The name rippled through the crowd like electricity. Richard Ashford, founder and CEO of Ashford Technologies. Net worth somewhere north of $8 billion. One of the most powerful men in Chicago, in the country, in the world. And he had just been saved by a homeless man who disappeared before anyone could even ask his name. The ambulance took Richard Ashford to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, lights flashing, siren clearing traffic. Inside, paramedics worked to stabilize him while the hospital's cardiac team prepared for arrival. By the time the ambulance pulled into the emergency bay, a full code team was waiting. They rushed Ashford into the cardiac unit, running tests, establishing 4 lines, monitoring vitals. He was alive, but barely. His heart had been stopped for several minutes. Brain damage was possible. Organ damage was likely. The next 24 hours would determine whether he recovered or whether the man who had saved him had simply delayed the inevitable. In the waiting room, Richard Ashford's security detail was making calls. To his wife. To his company's board. To lawyers and executives and handlers whose jobs depended on keeping Richard Ashford alive and functional. Who performed CPR? The head of security, a man named Thomas Price, asked the hospital administrator. According to the paramedics, it was a bystander, the administrator replied. He left the scene before they could get his information. "Find him," Price said. "I need to know who he is and I need his statement about what happened. Now." The hospital pulled security footage from the Ritz-Carlton. The video showed the moment of collapse, showed Richard Ashford walking out of the hotel's main entrance, pausing mid-step, his hand going to his chest. Showed him falling, people backing away, the doorman attempting CPR. And then showed the homeless man appearing, taking over, performing compressions with textbook precision until Ashford started breathing again. The footage was clear enough to see the homeless man's face, weathered and tired but focused. Clear enough to see his hands, rough but steady. Clear enough to see that he knew exactly what he was doing. "Run facial recognition," Price ordered. "Check arrest records, shelter registrations, anything. I want to know who this man is by morning." But facial recognition came back empty. The man's face was not in any criminal database. Not in any shelter registration system. Not in any government identification records they could access quickly. Whoever he was invisible to the systems designed to track people. "Pull traffic cameras," Price said. "Follow him. He went somewhere after he left the scene. Find out where." Traffic camera footage showed the homeless man walking east on Michigan Avenue, then south, then disappearing into the shadows beneath Lake Shore Drive where the cameras did not reach. The trail went cold at the edge of Grant Park. Price stood in the hospital administrator's office, watching the footage loop, watching this invisible man save Richard Ashford's life and then vanish like smoke. "Keep looking," Price said. and put out word on the street. Shelters, soup kitchens, outreach workers. Someone knows this man. I want him found. The homeless man did not go back to Grant Park that night. He knew there would be questions, knew that saving someone's life drew attention, knew that attention was dangerous when you were trying to stay invisible. Instead, he walked north along the lakefront, staying in the shadows, avoiding the areas where police cars patrolled. He walked for 3 hours until he reached a section of beach near Montrose Harbor where a small community of homeless people had built rough shelters in the rocks and brush. He found his spot, a space between 2 large boulders where he had wedged a tarp and a sleeping bag. He crawled inside, pulled the sleeping bag around himself, and lay still in the darkness. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline leaving his system. The reality of what he had done settling over him. He had broken his own rules, had drawn attention to himself, had used skills he was supposed to have forgotten, was supposed to have buried along with everything else from his previous life. But when he saw that man lying on the sidewalk, saw the doorman doing CPR wrong, saw death approaching with absolute certainty, he could not act, could not stand by and watch someone die when he had the knowledge and ability to prevent it. Some instincts ran too deep to be killed by circumstance or time. The homeless man closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring complications, that he had just made himself visible in ways that could destroy the fragile safety of anonymity he had built over the past 4 years. But he had saved a life. Whatever came next, at least he had done that. Richard Ashford woke up 36 hours later in a private room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. His throat was raw from the breathing tube. His chest ached. His head felt like it was wrapped in cotton. But he was alive. His wife Catherine was sitting beside the bed, her eyes red from crying. When she saw him open his eyes, she grabbed his hand and burst into fresh tears. "Richard," she said. "Oh God, Richard. What happened?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You had a heart attack," Catherine said. "Outside the Ritz. You collapsed. The doctor said if someone had not performed CPR immediately, you would have died. Your heart stopped for almost 8 minutes total. But someone saved you." Richard tried to process this. Heart attack. CPR. Saved. The memories were fragmented, unclear. He remembered feeling pressure in his chest as he left the hotel. Remembered his vision narrowing. Then nothing. Just darkness and the vague sense of someone counting, of pressure on his chest, of hands that knew what they were doing. "Who?" Richard asked. "Who performed CPR?" Catherine shook her head. "We do not know. A homeless man. He did CPR until the paramedics arrived, then he disappeared. Your security team has been trying to find him for 2 days. Nobody knows who he is. A homeless man." Richard turned this over in his mind, trying to make it make sense. A homeless man with the skill to perform CPR well enough to restart a heart. A homeless man who vanished before anyone could thank him or question him or even learn his name. "I want to find him," Richard said. "I want to thank him." "We are trying," Catherine said. "Everyone is trying." But he seems to have disappeared completely. Over the next week, as Richard Ashford recovered in the hospital and then at home, the search for the homeless man intensified. Thomas Price put investigators on it, hired private detectives, offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to his identity. The story had hit the news. "Homeless man saves billionaire's life" was the headline in the Chicago Tribune. The security footage from the Ritz-Carlton was played on every local news station, the image of the homeless man performing CPR becoming iconic in a city that usually tried to ignore its homeless population. Tips came in by the hundreds. People claimed to have seen him, to know him, to be him. But every lead was false or could not be verified. The homeless man remained anonymous, invisible despite being the subject of an intensive manhunt. Richard Ashford watched the footage over and over, studying the man who had saved his life. The way he moved, the confidence in his positioning, the clinical precision of his compressions. This was not a man who had taken a weekend CPR class. This was someone with serious medical training, someone who had performed emergency medicine many times before. Find out if any doctors have gone missing in the past decade, Richard told Thomas Price. Check medical license suspensions, malpractice lawsuits, anything that might explain why someone with that level of training would be living on the streets. The research came back with dozens of possibilities. Doctors who had lost their licenses. Physicians who had left the profession under clouds of scandal or addiction. Medical professionals who had simply disappeared from the system for reasons unknown. But none of the photos matched. None of the stories quite fit. The homeless man remained a mystery. 2 weeks after the heart attack, Richard Ashford returned to work at Ashford Technologies headquarters. His doctors had cleared him for limited duties, with strict instructions about stress management and cardiac rehabilitation. He felt weak, vulnerable in ways he had never experienced before. He had always been the kind of man who controlled things, who made things happen through force of will and strategic thinking. But you could not will your heart to keep beating. You could not strategize your way out of cardiac arrest. Someone had saved him. Someone he could not find, could not think, could not repay. It bothered him more than he would have expected. Richard Ashford was used to closing loops, to finishing transactions, to ensuring that debts were paid and obligations were met. This open-ended rescue, this anonymous salvation, felt wrong. Incomplete. Keep looking, he told Thomas Price. I do not care how long it takes or how much it costs. Find him. The homeless man knew they were searching. He saw his own face on newspapers, on TV screens, in store windows, in missing person flyers posted at homeless shelters. The reward had climbed to $50,000. People who had never looked at him before were now studying every homeless person they passed, wondering if this might be the man who saved Richard Ashford. He stayed away from his usual spots, avoided the shelters and soup kitchens where he normally got meals. Slept in different places each night, moving constantly, trusting no one. But winter was coming, and Chicago winters were not survivable on the streets without shelter, without resources, without community. He could avoid attention for a few weeks, maybe a month. But eventually, cold and hunger would force him into places where he would be seen, where he would be recognized. He was sitting under a bridge near Chinatown 3 weeks after the rescue, trying to decide what to do, when someone sat down beside him. The homeless man tensed, ready to run. But the person who sat down was not security or police or a reporter. It was an older man, maybe 70, wearing a threadbare coat and carrying a plastic bag with his belongings. Another homeless person, someone the man recognized from the shelters. They are looking for you, the old man said without preamble. His name was Frank, and he had been on the streets longer than anyone else in Chicago's homeless community. The Billionaire's people. They're showing your picture everywhere, offering big money. I know, the homeless man said quietly. Why are you hiding? Frank asked. You saved the man's life. He wants to thank you. Probably wants to give you money, help you get off the streets. Why are you running? The homeless man was quiet for a long time. Then he said, because gratitude is temporary, but the questions that come with it last forever. If I let them find me, they will want to know who I am, how I know CPR that well, why I am homeless. And I cannot answer those questions without revealing things that need to stay buried. Frank nodded slowly. So you have a past. Everyone has a past. But yours is the kind that ends badly if people find out. The homeless man did not respond, which was answer enough. Frank pulled out a sandwich from his bag, tore it in half, handed one piece to the homeless man. They ate in silence for a while, watching cars pass on the street above them. For what it is worth, Frank said eventually, I think you are making a mistake. Whatever you are running from, whatever you did or did not do, it cannot be worse than dying on the streets alone. That billionaire is offering you a way out. Maybe you should take it. And maybe I should not, the homeless man replied. Some doors are better left closed, Frank. Some pasts are better left buried. But even as he said it, he felt the weight of winter approaching, felt the exhaustion of constant movement and constant fear, felt the impossibility of maintaining invisibility when $50,000 was on the table and everyone was looking. He could not run forever. And he was so tired of running. The decision was made for him a week later when he collapsed outside a CVS pharmacy on the south side. He had not eaten in 3 days, had not slept properly in longer than that. His body, pushed past its limits by cold and hunger and stress, simply gave out. One moment he was walking, the next he was on the pavement, his vision graying out, his legs unable to hold him. Someone called an ambulance. He woke up in the emergency room at the University of Chicago Medical Center, hooked up to 4 fluids, a doctor checking his vitals. "You are severely dehydrated and malnourished," the doctor said. "When was the last time you ate?" The homeless man did not answer. He was already trying to figure out how to leave, how to disappear before someone made the connection between the homeless man in the ER and the homeless man everyone was searching for. But it was too late. A nurse had already seen his face, had already made the connection, had already notified hospital administration that the man who saved Richard Ashford was in their emergency room. Within an hour, Thomas Price was at the hospital with 2 security personnel and a lawyer. "Mr. Price paused, realizing he still did not know the man's name. "Sir, I am Thomas Price. I work for Richard Ashford. We have been looking for you." The homeless man sat up on the gurney, pulled the 4 from his arm despite the nurse's protests. "I am leaving." "Please," Price said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "We are not here to cause problems. Mr. Ashford wants to thank you. He wants to talk to you. That is all. No obligations. No pressure. Just a conversation." "I do not want his money," the homeless man said. "This is not about money," Price replied. "This is about a man wanting to meet the person who saved his life. Will you at least allow that?" The homeless man looked at Price, at the security personnel, at the nurse hovering nearby. He was cornered. Running would make things worse. And truthfully, he was too tired to run anymore. "Fine," he said quietly. "One conversation. Then I want to be left alone." Price nodded. "Agreed." They drove him to Richard Ashford's home in Lake Forest, a mansion that looked like something from a movie, all modern angles and walls of glass overlooking Lake Michigan. The homeless man sat in the back of the car, watching the landscape change from urban decay to manicured suburbs, feeling the distance between his world and this one grow with every mile. Richard Ashford was waiting in his study, a room filled with leather furniture and expensive art and floor-to-ceiling windows. He stood when the homeless man entered, and the 2 men looked at each other for a long moment. "Thank you for coming," Richard said finally. "I know you did not want to be found." The homeless man said nothing. "I am Richard Ashford," Richard continued, extending his hand. "And you saved my life." The homeless man did not take the offered hand. "I know who you are." Richard lowered his hand, not offended, just acknowledging the man's resistance. "May I ask your name?" The homeless man hesitated. Then, quietly, "Daniel. Daniel Cross." "Thank you, Daniel, for what you did. The doctors told me that if you had not performed CPR exactly as you did, I would have died or suffered permanent brain damage. You did not just save my life. You saved the quality of my life. That is not a debt I can easily repay." "I do not want repayment," Daniel said. "Then what do you want?" "To be left alone." Richard studied Daniel carefully. "You have medical training. Advanced medical training. The way you performed CPR, the terminology you used with the paramedics, that was not something you learned from a YouTube video. You were a doctor, were you not?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he did not respond. "I am not asking to invade your privacy," Richard said gently. "I am asking because I want to understand. How does someone with the skill to save lives end up living on the streets? What happened to you, Daniel?" "What happened to me is none of your business," Daniel said, his voice harder now. "I saved your life because someone needed to. That does not give you the right to my story." "You are correct," Richard acknowledged. "It does not. But I am still asking. Not as someone you owe anything to, but as someone who is grateful and who wants to help if help is possible." Daniel was quiet for a long time, his hands clenched in his lap. Richard waited, did not push, just allowed the silence to exist. Finally, Daniel spoke. I was a doctor. A long time ago. I am not anymore. That is all you need to know. Why not? Because I made mistakes. Because I failed people who trusted me. Because I could not save the person who mattered most, and that broke something in me that never healed. The words came out raw, painful, like exposing a wound that had never properly closed. Richard saw the anguish in Daniel's face, the weight of whatever history he was carrying. I am sorry, Richard said quietly. For whatever happened. For whatever you lost. Daniel looked at Richard with something like surprise, as if he had not expected compassion. Are you going to ask what I did? Whether I killed someone, whether I lost my license, whether I am dangerous. No, Richard said. Because I do not think you are dangerous. I think you are someone who suffered something terrible and responded by disappearing, by making yourself invisible. I understand that impulse. After my heart attack, I wanted to disappear too. To hide from the vulnerability, from the reminder that I am mortal and fragile and can be taken out by something I cannot control. But disappearing does not heal anything. It just postpones the pain. Daniel looked away, toward the windows and the lake beyond. What do you want from me, Mr. Ashford? I want to offer you something, Richard said. Not charity. Not pity. An opportunity. A chance to use your skills again, in a way that might help you heal. I cannot practice medicine, Daniel said. I do not have a license anymore. I would not even if I could. I am not asking you to practice medicine, Richard said. I am asking you to teach it. Daniel turned back to face Richard, confusion in his expression. I fund a medical education program for underserved communities, Richard explained. We train emergency responders, community health workers, people who want to help but cannot afford medical school. We need instructors. People who understand emergency medicine, who can teach CPR and first aid and triage. People like you. You want to hire me? Daniel said, disbelief in his voice. I want to give you a purpose again, Richard corrected. A way to use what you know. A place to exist that is not the streets or the past you are running from. No questions about your history. No background checks or judgments. Just your knowledge and your experience and your willingness to help others learn to save lives. Daniel stared at Richard, trying to find the trap, the hidden obligation, the catch that would turn this offer into something else. But Richard's face showed only sincerity, only genuine desire to help. Why? Daniel asked. Why would you do this for me? Because you gave me my life back, Richard said simply. Because I watched the footage of you performing CPR, and I saw someone who still cared about saving lives even when he had lost everything else. That matters. That has value. And it deserves recognition, not pity. Daniel felt something crack inside him, some defensive wall he had maintained for 4 years on the streets. He felt tears building and fought them back, fought to maintain control. I do not know if I can do it, he said quietly. I do not know if I am that person anymore. Then find out, Richard said. Take the job. Try it. If it does not work, you can leave. But at least give yourself the chance to be more than invisible. To be Daniel Cross again, whoever that person is underneath all the pain. Daniel started teaching 3 weeks later at the Chicago Community Health Initiative, a nonprofit program funded by the Ashford Foundation. He taught CPR, first aid, basic emergency response to a rotating group of students from neighborhoods on the south and west sides, people who wanted to help their communities but lacked formal training. The first day was terrifying. Daniel stood in front of 15 students, feeling exposed and fraudulent, convinced they would see through him, would recognize him as the broken man he had become. But then he started teaching and the words came back to him. The knowledge was still there, buried but intact. He demonstrated compressions on a practice dummy, his hands finding the familiar rhythm. He explained airway management, shock response, bleeding control. He answered questions with precision and clarity. And he realized something. He was still a doctor. Not in title or license, but in the fundamental knowledge and instinct that could not be erased by time or trauma. The part of him that knew how to save lives had survived everything else. One of his students, a 19-year-old named Marcus, stayed after class. "Sir, I have a question. How do you know when to stop? When do you know someone cannot be saved?" Daniel thought about this carefully. You do not stop until someone with more training tells you to stop, or until you physically cannot continue. Because you never know when the next compression might be the one that restarts the heart. You never know when one more breath might be the difference between life and death. So you do not give up. Not ever. Marcus nodded slowly. Is that why you saved that rich guy? Because you do not give up. Daniel met the young man's eyes. Yes. And because every life has value, regardless of who they are or what they have. That is what medicine teaches you. That when someone is dying, nothing else matters except trying to save them. Over the following months, Daniel taught hundreds of students. Young people from tough neighborhoods who wanted to become paramedics or nurses. Community organizers who wanted to make their blocks safer. Parents who wanted to protect their children. He taught them with the same precision he had once used in operating rooms, with the same dedication he had once brought to his medical practice. And slowly, carefully, Daniel began to heal. Not completely. The pain of whatever had driven him to the streets remained, sharp and present. But teaching gave him purpose again, gave him a way to be useful, to be more than the invisible man he had become. Richard Ashford visited the program occasionally, watching Daniel teach, seeing the confidence return to his movements, the authority return to his voice. They did not talk much during these visits. Just a nod of acknowledgement, a brief conversation about the program. But 6 months after Daniel started teaching, Richard asked him to lunch. They met at a quiet restaurant, not fancy, just comfortable. A place where they could talk without the weight of obligation. "How are you doing?" Richard asked. "Better," Daniel said honestly. "The teaching helps. Gives me something to focus on besides the past." "Do you want to talk about the past?" Richard asked carefully. "About what happened?" Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring at his coffee. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "I was an emergency room physician. Worked at Cook County Hospital for 12 years. I was good at my job. Really good. I saved a lot of lives. But emergency medicine is brutal. The hours, the stress, the constant exposure to trauma. I started drinking to cope. Just a little at first. Then more. Then it was the only way I could sleep, the only way I could turn off the images of everyone I could not save." He paused, his hands trembling slightly. "One night, I came to work after drinking. Not drunk, but impaired. And a patient came in, a woman having a heart attack. I missed the diagnosis. I thought it was anxiety, gave her the wrong medication. She died. She died because I was drunk and incompetent, and I did not see what was right in front of me." Richard said nothing, just listened. "Her name was Sarah Mitchell," Daniel continued, his voice breaking. "She was 34 years old. She had 2 children. She died in my ER because I failed her. The hospital investigated. Found out about the drinking. I lost my license. Lost my career. Lost my wife who could not forgive me for what I had done. Lost everything." Tears were running down Daniel's face now. "And the worst part is, I deserved it. I deserved to lose everything because Sarah Mitchell lost everything because of me. So I disappeared. Went to the streets. Figured that is what I deserved. To be invisible. To be nothing." "But you are not nothing," Richard said gently. "You saved my life. You are teaching hundreds of people to save lives. What happened to Sarah Mitchell was a tragedy. Your drinking was a terrible mistake. But you cannot spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for one catastrophic moment." "Why not?" Daniel asked bitterly. "Why do I deserve redemption when Sarah Mitchell is dead?" "Because redemption is not about deserving," Richard replied. "It is about choosing to be better than your worst moment. It is about taking the knowledge bought through tragedy and using it to prevent future tragedies. You cannot bring Sarah Mitchell back. But you can honor her memory by making sure other people learn to recognize heart attacks, by teaching a generation of emergency responders to be better than you were that night." Daniel looked at Richard through his tears. "You make it sound simple." It is not simple, Richard said. It is the hardest thing in the world. But it is possible. And I think, watching you teach over these past months, you are already doing it. You are already choosing to be more than your worst mistake. They sat in silence for a while, the restaurant noise fading into background hum. Then Richard spoke again. I have a proposition. The Ashford Foundation is expanding the community health program to 5 more cities. We need someone to oversee the curriculum, to train the trainers, to ensure quality across all locations. I want it to be you. Daniel shook his head. Richard, I cannot. You can, Richard interrupted. You have proven that over the past 6 months. You are an excellent teacher. You understand emergency medicine at a deep level. And you have the moral authority of someone who has failed and learned from that failure. That makes you exactly the right person for this position. What about my history? What about Sarah Mitchell? What about her? Richard asked. Your history is your history. It does not disqualify you from helping people. If anything, it qualifies you. Because you understand what is at stake when someone makes a mistake in emergency medicine. You understand the weight of that responsibility. That understanding makes you better at teaching, not worse. Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to insist he was not worthy of this second chance. But he also felt something he had not felt in years, hope. The possibility that his life could be more than penance, that his knowledge could serve a purpose beyond atonement. Okay, Daniel said quietly. I will do it. Over the next 2 years, Daniel Cross rebuilt his life. Not the life he had before, but something new, something earned through teaching and dedication, and the slow, painful work of forgiving himself. The Ashford Foundation's community health program expanded to 7 cities. Daniel traveled constantly, training instructors, developing curriculum, ensuring that the program maintained the highest standards. He became known in emergency medicine circles as an expert in community-based health education, was invited to speak at conferences, to consult with other organizations. His students from Chicago stayed in touch. Several had become paramedics, were working in ambulances across the city. One had used CPR to save her neighbor's life during a heart attack. Another had stopped a child from choking at a restaurant. They sent Daniel messages, telling him how the training had mattered, how they had saved lives because he taught them how. Each message felt like a small redemption. Not enough to erase Sarah Mitchell. Nothing could do that. But enough to prove that his existence still had value, that the knowledge he carried could still do good in the world. Richard Ashford remained involved, not as a boss, but as a friend. They met for lunch regularly, talked about the program, about life, about the strange journey that had connected them. Richard told Daniel about his recovery from the heart attack, about how the experience had changed his perspective on what mattered. Before the heart attack, I thought I was invincible, Richard said during one of these lunches. I thought money and power and control could protect me from anything. But you cannot buy your way out of cardiac arrest. You cannot negotiate with death. It took being completely helpless, completely dependent on a stranger's skill, to understand how fragile everything is. He looked at Daniel. You gave me that understanding. And you also gave me the chance to help you, which has been one of the most meaningful things I have ever done with my wealth. So thank you, Daniel, for saving my life and for letting me be part of saving yours. Daniel felt his throat tighten. I am not sure my life was worth saving, Richard. But I am grateful you thought it was. Every life is worth saving, Richard said firmly. That is what you taught me, remember? When someone is dying, nothing else matters. Not their past. Not their mistakes. Just that they deserve a chance to keep living. 3 years after saving Richard Ashford's life, Daniel Cross stood outside Cook County Hospital, the place where his career had ended, where he had killed Sarah Mitchell through negligence and alcohol. He had not been back since the investigation, since the license revocation hearing, since the day he walked out knowing he would never practice medicine again. But today was different. Today he was here on purpose. Inside the hospital, in a conference room on the 3rd floor, 15 emergency medicine residents were waiting to hear him speak. Not about CPR or first aid. About mistakes. About failure. about what happens when you are trusted with a life and you destroy it through your own weakness. The hospital's chief of emergency medicine had invited him. "Our residents are brilliant," she had said. "But they're also young and sometimes arrogant. They need to understand that competence is not enough. That one moment of impairment, one error in judgment, one instance of overconfidence can destroy not just a patient, but your entire career. They need to hear from someone who has lived that." Daniel had almost refused. The thought of walking back into Cook County, of standing in front of young doctors and confessing what he had done, felt like more than he could bear. But then he thought about Marcus, his former student who was now a paramedic. About the dozens of other students who had learned from him. About the possibility that telling his story might prevent one future doctor from making the same mistake he had made. So he had said yes. Now, standing outside the hospital, Daniel took a deep breath. His hands were shaking. His heart was racing. But he pushed through the entrance and made his way to the conference room. The residents looked up when he entered. Young faces, confident faces, faces that reminded him of who he had been at their age. Brilliant and dedicated and absolutely certain they would never fail the way others had failed. "My name is Daniel Cross," he began, his voice steady despite his fear. 15 years ago, I was an attending physician in this hospital's emergency department. I was good at my job. I saved lives. And then one night, I killed someone through negligence and alcohol abuse. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she died because I was impaired and missed a clear diagnosis of myocardial infarction. The room was silent. The residents sat forward, their earlier casual confidence replaced by sharp attention. Daniel told them everything. The drinking, the denial, the moment he walked into the ER impaired and convinced himself he was fine to work. The woman with chest pain and anxiety who was actually having a heart attack. The wrong medication. The crash. The futile attempts at resuscitation. The moment he realized what he had done. "I lost my license," Daniel continued. "I lost my marriage. I lost my identity. I became homeless, spent 4 years on the streets, convinced I deserved nothing better because I had taken everything from Sarah Mitchell." He paused, looking at each resident. "I am telling you this story because I need you to understand something. You are all brilliant. You have worked incredibly hard to be here. But brilliance is not enough. Hard work is not enough. You also need humility. You need to understand that you are human, that you are fallible, that one bad decision can destroy a life. Not just your patient's life. Your life too." One resident raised her hand. "How did you survive it? How did you keep going after something like that?" "Badly," Daniel said honestly. "I did not survive it well. I ran away. I hid. I punished myself by becoming invisible. It took a random coincidence, saving someone's life while homeless, to pull me back. To give me a reason to believe I could still be useful despite what I had done." "Do you still feel guilty?" another resident asked. "Every single day," Daniel said. "Sarah Mitchell is never far from my thoughts. The guilt does not go away. It becomes part of you, changes you, shapes every decision you make afterward. But I have learned that guilt can be either destructive or constructive. I can let it destroy me, or I can let it drive me to be better, to teach others, to honor Sarah's memory by preventing future deaths." He looked around the room. "You will all make mistakes in your careers. That is inevitable in medicine. The question is whether you will learn from those mistakes or be destroyed by them. Whether you will use them to become better physicians or let them end you. I am asking you to choose learning. To choose growth. To choose to be better than your worst moment." After the talk, several residents came up to Daniel, thanking him, asking questions, sharing their own fears about making catastrophic errors. One young doctor, tears in her eyes, told him about a patient she had lost the previous month, about the guilt that was consuming her. "It was not your fault," Daniel told her gently. "Not all deaths in medicine are preventable. But learn from it anyway. Figure out what you could have done differently, even if the outcome would have been the same. That is how you honor your patients. By becoming better because they existed." As Daniel left Cook County Hospital that day, He felt something shift inside him. For years, his guilt over Sarah Mitchell had been a weight that crushed him, that made him believe he deserved invisibility and punishment. But standing in front of those residents, sharing his story, using his failure to teach others, he realized that guilt could serve a different purpose. It could make him better, could make him more careful, more humble, more committed to teaching others to avoid his mistakes. Sarah Mitchell's death was a tragedy that nothing could undo. But it did not have to be meaningless. It could teach. It could warn. It could prevent future tragedies if Daniel was brave enough to keep sharing what he had learned. For years after the rescue, Daniel received an unexpected message. It was from Sarah Mitchell's daughter, now 21 years old and in college. Dr. Cross, the message read. My name is Emma Mitchell. You probably do not remember me, but you were the doctor who was there when my mother died. I was 13 when it happened. I have spent the last 8 years hating you for what you did, for taking my mother from me. But recently I saw a video of you speaking at a medical conference about medical errors and recovery. I watched you talk about my mother, about what you did, about the guilt you have carried. And I realized something. You have spent 8 years punishing yourself more severely than I could ever punish you. You have used your mistake to teach hundreds of doctors to be better. You have saved lives by teaching others to recognize the signs you missed that night. I am not writing to forgive you. I do not know if I can do that. My mother is still gone. I still grew up without her. But I am writing to tell you that I see what you have done with your guilt. I see that you have not run from it or minimized it. You have carried it and used it to help others. That matters. That means something. My mother would want me to tell you that. She was a nurse before she had me. She understood medical mistakes happen. She would not want you to spend your whole life invisible and punished. She would want you to do exactly what you are doing, using what you learned to prevent others from experiencing what she experienced. So thank you, Dr. Cross, for not forgetting her, for carrying her memory, for making her death mean something beyond just loss. Daniel read the message 3 times, tears streaming down his face. He had never expected forgiveness from Sarah Mitchell's family, had never believed he deserved it. But this acknowledgement, this recognition that his penance had purpose, felt like a gift he had not known he needed. He wrote back carefully, thanking Emma for her message, telling her about the memorial fund he had established in Sarah Mitchell's name that provided addiction treatment for healthcare workers struggling with substance abuse. He told her that her mother's death had taught him about the weight of responsibility, about the cost of impairment, about the need for systems that supported struggling physicians before they hurt patients. Emma wrote back. They began a careful correspondence, not quite friendship, but something like mutual understanding. She told him about her mother, about memories Daniel had never known, about the woman whose life he had ended. And in hearing about Sarah Mitchell as a person, as a mother, as someone who had dreams and fears and favorite songs, Daniel's guilt deepened but also transformed into something more complex. She was not just the patient he had killed. She was a full human being whose absence created ripples in the world, whose loss mattered to people who loved her. And honoring her memory meant not just carrying guilt, but actively working to prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. 5 years after saving Richard Ashford's life, the Ashford Foundation announced a new initiative, the Sarah Mitchell Center for Medical Error Prevention and Recovery. The center would provide support for healthcare workers struggling with addiction, would offer counseling for physicians who had made serious medical errors, and would research systems-level changes to prevent future mistakes. Daniel was named the center's director. The announcement generated significant media attention. The story of the homeless man who saved a billionaire and rebuilt his life had never quite faded from public consciousness. Now, learning that the homeless man had been a doctor who lost everything due to a fatal medical error, the story took on new complexity. Some people praised Daniel's redemption, his commitment to using his mistakes to prevent future harm. Others questioned whether someone who had killed a patient through negligence should be leading an initiative related to medical safety. Daniel expected the criticism, welcomed it, even. It meant people were thinking about the issues, about medical errors and addiction, and the systems that allowed physicians to practice while impaired. At the center's opening ceremony, Daniel stood before a crowd of physicians, administrators, and media. Behind him was a plaque with Sarah Mitchell's name and her daughter Emma beside him. "This center exists because I failed," Daniel began. "Because I was an alcoholic who thought I could practice medicine while impaired. Because I missed a diagnosis any competent physician should have caught. Because Sarah Mitchell died when she should have lived." He paused, looking at Emma, who nodded encouragement. "For years, I believed the appropriate response to that failure was to disappear, to punish myself through invisibility and suffering. But that approach serves no one. It does not bring Sarah Mitchell back. It does not prevent future errors. It is self-indulgent and ultimately cowardly. This center represents a different approach. It acknowledges that physicians are human, that we are fallible, that we will make mistakes. But it also insists that when we make mistakes, we have a responsibility to learn from them, to share what we have learned, to create systems that prevent others from repeating our errors. The Sarah Mitchell Center will provide support for physicians struggling with addiction before they harm patients. It will offer counseling and peer support for doctors who have made serious errors and are contemplating suicide because they cannot live with their guilt. It will research how hospitals can create cultures of safety rather than cultures of blame. And it will ensure that Sarah Mitchell's death was not meaningless, that it taught us something that saves future lives. Daniel looked directly at the cameras. "If you are a physician struggling with addiction, with depression, with the weight of a mistake you have made, please reach out to this center. You do not have to disappear. You do not have to punish yourself through suffering. There is a path forward that includes accountability and growth and continued service to medicine. That path is hard. It requires facing what you have done and who you have hurt. But it is possible. I am proof it is possible." The speech was replayed on news channels, shared across social media, generated thousands of responses from physicians who had been struggling in silence. The center's hotline was overwhelmed with calls in the first week. Doctors who had been hiding addictions. Physicians who had made errors and were contemplating suicide. Healthcare workers who needed help but had been too afraid to seek it because of professional consequences. Daniel worked 18-hour days in those first months, building the infrastructure, training counselors, developing programs. He drew on his own experience of failure and recovery, on the 4 years he spent homeless, on the slow, painful process of learning to be useful again despite catastrophic mistakes. And gradually, the center began to make a difference. Physicians entered treatment for addiction before harming patients. Doctors who had made serious errors found support and paths forward that did not involve ending their careers or their lives. Hospitals began implementing the center's recommendations for improving safety culture. The work was exhausting but meaningful in ways Daniel had never experienced before. This was not just saving individual lives through CPR or teaching. This was changing systems, preventing harm at scale, creating a world where fewer Sarah Mitchells died because fewer physicians practiced while impaired. 7 years after the rescue, Richard Ashford invited Daniel to his home for dinner. It had become an annual tradition, a quiet evening where they talked about the program's growth, about their lives, about the strange bond that connected them. But this year, Richard had something specific to discuss. "I am stepping back from day-to-day operations at Ashford Technologies," Richard said over dessert. "The heart attack taught me something about mortality, about the need to focus on what matters while I still can. I am transitioning to full-time work with the foundation." "That is a big decision," Daniel said. "It is the right decision," Richard replied. "And I want you to join me. Not as an employee. As a partner. Co-director of the Ashford Foundation. Equal authority. Equal input into how we use our resources to improve healthcare access and safety." Daniel stared at Richard, stunned. "I cannot, that is too much." "Why?" Richard interrupted. "Because you made a mistake years ago? Because you think you are not worthy? Daniel, you have spent 7 years proving your worth. You have built programs that save lives. You have changed healthcare culture around error disclosure and physician well-being. You have earned this position through competence and dedication, not through pity or obligation. But the foundation has your name on it, Daniel said. It should be run by someone whose reputation does not include killing a patient. The foundation has my name because I have money, Richard said bluntly. But you have expertise and moral authority. You have lived through failure and recovered. That makes you far more qualified to direct healthcare programs than someone like me who has never faced real consequences for mistakes. He leaned forward. 7 years ago, you saved my life when you had every reason to stay invisible, to protect yourself. You risked exposure and judgment because saving lives mattered more than safety. Now I am asking you to risk visibility again, to step into leadership, to use your story and your knowledge to shape how we approach healthcare in this country. Will you do it? Daniel thought about Sarah Mitchell, about Emma, about the thousands of physicians who had reached out to the center seeking help, about his students from Chicago who were now saving lives across the city, about the strange journey from emergency room physician to homeless man to teacher to foundation director. Yes, Daniel said quietly. Yes, I will do it. 10 years after saving Richard Ashford's life, Daniel Cross stood in the lobby of the Sarah Mitchell Center's new national headquarters in Chicago. The building was modern and welcoming, designed to feel safe rather than institutional, a place where struggling physicians could seek help without fear of judgment. On the wall beside the entrance was a photograph of Sarah Mitchell, smiling, alive, beautiful. Beneath it was a plaque. Sarah Mitchell, RN 1972 to 2006. Her death taught us that every healthcare worker deserves support. Her memory drives our commitment to preventing future tragedies. Daniel paused in front of the photograph every morning, the same ritual he had maintained for 10 years. I am still trying, Sarah, he said quietly. Still trying to make your death mean something. Behind him, the center staff was arriving for the day. Counselors who worked with addicted physicians. Peer support specialists who helped doctors process medical errors. Researchers studying safety culture and error prevention. They nodded to Daniel as they passed, comfortable with his daily conversation with the photograph, understanding that some guilt never fully healed but could be transformed into purpose. Emma Mitchell worked at the center now, having become a social worker specifically to help families affected by medical errors. She approached Daniel as he stood before her mother's photograph. She would be proud of you, Emma said gently. Of what you have built. I hope so, Daniel replied. I will never know for certain. But I can keep trying to deserve that. They walked together into the center, into a building that existed because Daniel Cross had failed catastrophically and then refused to let that failure be the end of his story. He had saved Richard Ashford while homeless, had accepted help when he wanted to refuse it, had rebuilt himself through teaching and service and the slow, painful work of atonement. And now, a decade later, he was co-directing one of the country's most influential healthcare foundations, creating programs that saved lives at scale, changing medical culture to be more supportive of struggling physicians, ensuring that fewer families lost mothers and fathers to preventable medical errors. It was not redemption, exactly. Sarah Mitchell was still dead. That could never be undone. But it was purpose. It was meaning extracted from tragedy. It was the choice to be better than your worst moment, to use failure as fuel for growth rather than destruction. That afternoon, Daniel taught a CPR class at a community center on the south side. He still taught occasionally, still felt most himself when demonstrating compressions, when explaining airway management, when giving people the knowledge to save lives. One of his students, a 17-year-old girl named Jasmine, stayed after class. Mr. Cross, she said hesitantly. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you still teach these classes? You run that big foundation now. You could pay people to do this. Why do you still show up? Daniel thought about the question carefully. Because teaching reminds me who I am. Not the person who runs a foundation or gives speeches at conferences. The person who knows how to save lives and believes that knowledge should be shared. That person exists regardless of titles or positions. And I never want to forget him. He looked at Jasmine. Also, because you never know when one person you teach will save a life. Maybe it will be you. Maybe in 5 years you will be walking down the street and someone will collapse and you will remember these compressions, this rhythm. And maybe you will save them. That possibility makes every class worth teaching. Jasmine nodded slowly. Did you always want to teach people to save lives? No, Daniel said honestly. I wanted to save lives myself. To be the hero in the emergency room. But life does not always give you what you want. Sometimes it gives you what you need instead. And what I needed was to learn humility, to understand that saving lives does not require being the person doing the saving. Sometimes it means teaching others to do it. Sometimes it means creating systems that make saving easier. Sometimes it means being invisible so others can be visible. He smiled at Jasmine. You asked why I still teach. That is why. Because the most important lessons I have learned came from losing everything and discovering what mattered underneath all the things I thought defined me. And I want to pass those lessons forward. To you. To everyone who will listen. 15 years after saving Richard Ashford's life, Daniel Cross received an award from the American Medical Association for his work in physician wellness and medical error prevention. The ceremony was held in Chicago, in a hotel ballroom filled with doctors and healthcare leaders. Daniel almost did not attend. Awards felt strange, uncomfortable, like recognition he had not earned. But Richard, now in his 70s and still actively involved with the foundation, insisted. You are being honored for saving thousands of lives, Richard said. Not directly. Not dramatically. But through systems and support and culture change. That deserves recognition. So Daniel went to the ceremony, put on a suit that still felt foreign after years of homeless clothes and casual teacher wear, sat at a table with Richard and Emma and members of the center's staff. When his name was called, Daniel walked to the stage, accepted the award, stood at the podium looking out at hundreds of physicians. He had prepared remarks. Professional, appropriate, safely within the boundaries of what was expected. He set the prepared remarks aside. 15 years ago, Daniel began, I was living under a bridge, invisible to everyone, convinced I deserved nothing better because I had killed a patient through negligence and alcoholism. I thought my story was over. I thought the best thing I could do was disappear and stop causing harm. Then I saved someone's life. Not because I wanted recognition. Not because I wanted to be found. But because someone was dying and I had the knowledge to prevent it. And that act of saving brought me back into the world, made me visible again, gave me a second chance I did not believe I deserved. He looked at Richard in the audience. The man I saved insisted on helping me. Not with money or charity. With opportunity. With the chance to be useful again. To teach. To serve. To use my knowledge and my failure to help others. This award is not for me alone. It is for every physician who has struggled with addiction and sought help. For every doctor who has made a serious error and chosen to learn from it rather than be destroyed by it. For every healthcare worker who has faced their own failures and used them as fuel for growth rather than despair. We live in a culture that demands perfection from physicians, that punishes failure severely, that gives little support for the mental health challenges inherent in this work. That culture needs to change. And it is changing slowly because of the work being done by hundreds of people committed to physician wellness and safety. I am honored to receive this award. But I accept it on behalf of Sarah Mitchell, whose death taught me about the cost of impairment. On behalf of Richard Ashford, whose near death taught me about the value of second chances. And on behalf of every physician who has faced their worst moment and chosen to become better because of it rather than broken by it. The applause was sustained, emotional. But Daniel barely heard it. He was looking at the back of the room, at a doorway, at a memory of who he had been 15 years ago when he was invisible and broken and convinced he had nothing left to offer the world. That person was still part of him. Would always be part of him. The guilt, the failure, the years on the streets, they had shaped him as surely as his medical training and teaching experience. He could not separate the broken parts from the healed parts. They were all Daniel Cross. All pieces of the same complicated story. After the ceremony, After the congratulations and photographs and formal conversations, Daniel walked outside into the Chicago night. The city looked different than it had 15 years ago when he had walked these same streets invisible and homeless. Or maybe he was the one who looked different. Who saw differently? He walked to Michigan Avenue, to the spot outside the Ritz-Carlton where Richard Ashford had collapsed, where Daniel had made the choice to step forward and be seen again. The sidewalk looked ordinary now, just concrete and pedestrians and city noise. No evidence remained of the moment that changed both their lives. But Daniel remembered. Remembered kneeling beside a dying man, remembered his hands finding the rhythm of compressions, remembered making the choice to use his knowledge despite knowing it would expose him, would bring questions and attention and the risk of his past being revealed. He had been terrified that day. Terrified of being seen, of being judged, of having to explain how a doctor ended up homeless and invisible. But he had done it anyway because someone needed help and he had the ability to provide it. That choice, that moment of stepping forward despite fear, had given him everything that came after. The teaching, the center, the foundation, the transformation of his guilt into purpose. All of it traced back to the decision to be more than invisible, to risk exposure for the sake of saving a life. Daniel pulled out his phone and called Richard, who answered immediately despite the late hour. "Thank you," Daniel said simply. "For what?" Richard asked. "For insisting on finding me. For refusing to let me stay invisible. For giving me a chance to be useful again. For believing I was worth saving when I did not believe it myself." Richard was quiet for a moment. "Daniel, you saved my life. But more than that, you gave me the opportunity to help save yours. That has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. So thank you for letting me help. For accepting support when you wanted to refuse it. For choosing to step back into the world instead of hiding in guilt and shame." They talked for a few more minutes, then said goodnight. Daniel stood on Michigan Avenue for a while longer, watching people pass, thinking about visibility and invisibility, about the choices that define lives, about the strange paths that lead from brokenness to purpose. Then he walked home to his apartment, to the life he had rebuilt piece by piece over 15 years, to the knowledge that tomorrow he would wake up and continue the work of atonement, of service, of using his failures to prevent others from experiencing the same tragedies. It was not a perfect life. The guilt never fully left. Sarah Mitchell remained a weight he carried every day. But it was a meaningful life. A useful life. A life that mattered because he had chosen to make it matter, to transform catastrophe into growth, to be more than his worst moment. The homeless man who saved a billionaire's life had become Dr. Daniel Cross again. Not the person he had been before Sarah Mitchell, but someone new. Someone forged by failure and rebuilt through service. Someone who understood that true healing came not from forgetting the past, but from using it to create a better future. And every morning, when Daniel stood before Sarah Mitchell's photograph at the center that bore her name, he renewed his commitment to that work. To honoring her memory. To ensuring her death taught lessons that saved lives. To being worthy of the second chance Richard Ashford had insisted on giving him. That was the real story. Not homeless man saves billionaire. But two broken people, one killed by cardiac arrest and one killed by guilt, both choosing to live again, both using their brush with death to create something meaningful from catastrophe. And in a small office at the Sarah Mitchell Center, on a door marked with a simple brass nameplate, were two names. Dr. Daniel Cross, Co-Director, Ashford Foundation. The name on the door did not erase the past, did not absolve the guilt, did not bring Sarah Mitchell back to life. But it proved that redemption was possible. That failure did not have to be final. That someone who had lost everything could build something new from the ruins. And for Daniel Cross, formerly homeless, formerly invisible, formerly convinced he deserved nothing better than punishment and shame, that name on that door meant he had finally stepped back into the light. Not as the person he was before, but as someone better. Someone humbled by failure. Someone committed to service. Someone who knew the weight of saving lives because he also knew the weight of taking them. He touched the nameplate gently as he entered his office, the same gesture he made every morning. A reminder, a promise, a commitment to continue earning the second chance that Richard Ashford had insisted he deserved, and that he had spent 15 years learning to accept. The homeless man had saved a billionaire's life, but in the end, they had saved each other. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.